Okay, everyone, just calm down. Everyone just relax, alright? Let's not lose our minds here. Everyone around the world just needs to get a hold of themselves and take a deep breath. Maybe a deep breath isn't such a good idea as there is something in the air. Think about what we've all been dealing with for the past few years. Presidency, rumors of war, tension between nations, the breakdown of unity amongst people in our personal relationships, the division of society and our own personal values, the changes in climate, the melting of ice in the Arctic regions, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, freak weather patterns, space debris, thoughts of Planet X, exploding stars, the increase in cosmic and ground level radiation. And to top it all off, there's another dragon that is roaming among us in the form of plague. And it couldn't have come at a worse time, right? So what should we have expected to happen? For people to sit quietly in their homes, twiddle their thumbs, and wait for this virus to just go away? Of course not. The psychological defense mechanisms kick in like they would in any other person. And people go out and buy anything and everything they can get their hands on when it comes to consumables. Reality kicks in for you when you casually go to the store and you see the shelves empty. And this is the start of quite an annoying day. Especially when something that you need is no longer available and accessible as it usually is. So aside from what people will do with their money when something like a pandemic occurs, we will be looking at what else to expect from such an event. So here we go. The next event is taking place. It's happening. And what's to come next? Well, we're going to take a look at that. The question is, are you ready for it? So for those of you who are not familiar with John Costi, he is the author of the international bestseller, X Events, Complexity Overload and the Collapse of Everything. And in that book, he goes over and describes how certain events would most likely play out in today's world, and how human civilization could collapse due to such things as a nuclear apocalypse, a meteor strike, an AI takeover, a worldwide contagion. Now, back in 2011, Costi put together a report for the OECD, International Futures Project, on future global shocks, entitled Four Faces of Tomorrow. And so I'm going to go over what he has put together concerning pandemics, and hopefully at the end we will have a better understanding of what we may be facing today. Now, there are a few definitions that I would like to go over that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but I would like to review those for the following context. Number one, as defined in this report, is incidence. An incidence is the number of new cases of a disease that appear in a given population of a specified period of time. 2, an epidemic. An excessive and related incidence of a particular disease above what is normal for a given population. 3, a pandemic. An epidemic that spreads beyond a given continent and becomes a wide-ranging problem. And number 4, an endemic. A disease having a relatively low base level incidence rate, but one that is not necessarily constant. For example, the common cold is the most typical endemic disease in just about any population. We all know that humankind has seen the likes of an epidemic or even a pandemic several times throughout our existence. Also, we have seen in the past decade or so a number of viruses try to make it around the world. Costi does list a few historically significant events, and the stats on these are quite interesting and at the same time quite scary. For example, back in 165 to 180 AD, there was a suspected outbreak of smallpox in Rome. This plagued Rome for more than a decade, killing off some 5,000 people per day at the height of the long-term event, ending with a total of around 5 million deaths. Costi mentions a very nasty bubonic plague around 541 to 750 AD called the Plague of Justinian that spread out from Egypt into Europe and Asia, killing about 10,000 people per day at its peak and ending with half the population gone in the areas it infected. He lists the Black Death of the 13 and 1400s, 100 million gone over a 200-year period. The Spanish flu, 1918 through 1919, within that very short time, had killed around 100 million. As you go on to read the report, Costi uses Ebola as an example of how a deadly virus starts off and spreads out. And if you have never heard of how Ebola was suspected of starting, Costi writes, in 1976, Babako Lokela was a 44-year-old school teacher in Zaire, returning from a trip to the north of the country in late summer that year. He became sick with a very high fever. During the next week, he started vomiting and began to bleed from his nose, mouth, and anus. He died less than a week later. At the time, no one could pinpoint the cause of his death, although now he is seen as the first victim of what we now call Ebola fever. Now, there are a few more terms that I want to read to you from the report, and these are summaries of terms that are used in Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point. Listen to this. The law of the few. There exists exceptional people in a population who are somehow extremely well connected and at the same time strongly virulent. Thus, these few special people have the ability to expose a disproportionately large number of the population to the infectious agent. In the lingo of the epidemiological community, such people are termed super spreaders. An outbreak of SARS in Toronto, for instance, was traced to such a super spreader. The stickiness factor. This law says that there are relatively few simple changes that can be made to many pathogens that enable them to hang on in a population year after year. Influenza is a good example of this, where each autumn new strands of last year's virus appear, each a slight modification of what came before. The changes being just enough to enable the virus to slip through the body's immune system and infect a population. The power of context. This law asserts that humans are a lot more sensitive to their environment than it may seem at first glance. In other words, whether people are ready to change their behavior and, for instance, voluntarily quarantine themselves or even take basic precautionary measures to avoid infection, such as wearing a mask or even washing their hands, depends on the cultural standards of the particular population they belong to. In a small town, people will react differently than in a major metropolis. And that difference may be the difference that matters insofar as whether an epidemic breaks out or not. Now, the report goes on to discuss the World Health Organization's phases of a pandemic and the three main ways to stop a pandemic early on. It talks about the methodology for the knowns and unknowns of a pandemic. And then this report that was published in 2011 surprisingly reads this, and I quote, "The world of 2020 looks bleak. Since 2010, the globe has been swept by highly contagious, deadly viruses that flare up, die down, and return in mutated form. The world economy has declined sharply as trade and commerce have dried up, and is now mired in a serious, long-term recession. Many nations have either become authoritarian, ruled by demagogic strongmen, or simply succumbed to chaos. The U.S. is among a handful of countries fortunate enough to have resilient political structures and relatively low fatality rates. These countries have signed a mutual assistance treaty to find a cure for the viruses and protect national security. The viable states have sealed their borders, but they are constantly threatened by mass migration attempts from less fortunate neighborhoods. In the US, the traditional Democratic and Republican parties have been replaced by the Greens and the Techs. The former look to a return to basic living and tend to blame technology for the world's current evils, while the latter look to medical research and technology to solve the current crisis. Power increasingly resides in community groups and local health centers, most of which are connected to and supported by the federal government. The public has generally agreed to sacrifice some personal freedoms in favor of medical IDs and increased surveillance of potentially unhealthy populations. The internet has evolved into the global information grid, which is the preferred method of purchasing, communication, and education, allowing people to avoid large groups and crowded areas. It is one of the few ambiguous signs of progress in this world. So what I have just read of this report comes out of the book X Events, The Collapse of Everything, from a chapter entitled, I'm Sick of It, a Global Pandemic. And it is not within this chapter that you see the entire event play out. It is the other X events that a global pandemic could trigger. And it is there where you see these other scenarios unfolding as a result. For example, within the same chapter, Costi brings up an important point about what we are facing, and that is personal freedom versus public health. And he gives a good example of this with the story of Typhoid Mary. Typhoid or typhoid infection is a bacteria infection caused by salmonella poisoning. It causes diarrhea, vomiting, a high fever, and it can be fatal. It also spreads when a person with typhoid handles food and beverages. So if you haven't heard this story before, here's what happened in a summary. Mary Mallon was her name. She was an Irish immigrant who went to work as a cook in New York City back in the early 1900s. And within 7 years, she was able to infect a couple dozen people with the disease. But she didn't know it because her symptoms had already came and went. She no longer showed any signs of the infection. However, when the authorities finally caught up to her, they quarantined her in isolation at a hospital for about 3 years. They finally released her on the grounds that she would no longer work in the food industry. Now, she didn't listen to them and ended up going back to work as a cook in New York. And guess what? She infected a bunch of folks and was sent back into quarantine, where she remained for over 20 years until she died of pneumonia. So the question that came up was, how do we balance someone's personal rights and liberties against the rights of the public not wanting to get infected? By the way, I apologize for the creepy photo. Most of her photos are creepy. But that type of situation is also creepy because here is reality. How do you separate, because this is global now, how do you keep the infected separated from the non-infected? And for how long? Let's say you have a family member that lives a good distance from you. They've been infected and have already recovered from this thing. You have not. Is this family member still able to infect you? What happened to the virus? Was it completely destroyed? Or did this person just gain an immunity to it and are still a carrier? Does it become a matter of that person's viral load at that point? If the body doesn't get rid of it completely, here's the thing about what's going on today. The way things seem to be going with the virus itself, and I hope I'm wrong, but just like the common cold, it's probably something that everyone will eventually catch. Doesn't mean anything is going to happen to you at that stage in the game, but that does seem like how that's going to work because of the method that it spreads from human to human. I, for one, pray that we see it vanish. Now, there are 11 X events in this book, and I just want to point out a few other events that could be triggered by plague. For example, X event 2, entitled, When Do We Eat? Breakdown of the global food supply system. Look, folks, we were already having an issue with this, with farmers losing crops all across the country. You think other countries have an endless supply of food? You've all seen the shelves at the markets, right? virus or no virus, that's real. Everything shutting down all around you, that's real too. Yes, as human beings, we need a little fear in us to get us off our asses and into action. But that must be balanced with a sober mind. So this is how this works. The price of food is already sky high. There's food here, but the demand is already exceeding the supply in many outlets. Not just because people are buying everything off the shelves, but the climate in many agricultural sectors, the drought plus the flooding, this crazy weather has assisted in devastating certain crops. See, we live in an ecosystem where certain organisms rely and depend on other organisms to live. One thing affects the other. Here's something I bet most people haven't considered yet. With this bug that has spread quite a bit, how will this affect our honeybee population? Because honeybees can be readily infected with RNA viruses, I'm not saying that bees will catch this virus going around, no. Honeybees are already dealing with a virus that humans helped spread due to honeybee trade from Asia and Europe, the deformed wing virus. These viruses that infect bees usually comes from mites. See, the problem is honeybees account for around 1/3 of the world's food production. Almond production is a big thing in California that requires a lot of bee colonies. What happens when shipments of honeybees between states becomes restricted or slowed down? Well, the honeybees starve, the crops starve, and we've got a big problem due to about 70% of honeybees in America are used for almond crops. This is already happening in China. Beekeepers can't get their bee shipments out. The bees can't get their sustenance and sources for food. So yeah. What about truck drivers in general? How are they dealing with this issue? You think they are going to want to willingly drive into an infected area? What happens to the price of oil when you have disruptions in blocks in transportation and shipping? Well, the prices for gas fall, of course. But what that requires is that oil producers pump out more oil, which is not exactly what we wanted for the environment, am I right? It will be interesting to see how this will ultimately affect us economically, because normally in a deflationary spiral, you have prices going down, which means companies make less money, which means they make less profit, which means they now have to cut workers. Now families have less money to spend, which means companies have to lower prices even more to get people to spend. And the cycle repeats itself. This is laid out in the X Events book. But see, with quarantine, access is restricted and so demand remains high. So people can't spend their money on certain things even if they wanted to. You see how this pandemic really throws everything else off? We apparently have animals and people spreading this thing. How does this affect our food supply? I mean, the municipal water supply has so many chemicals in it, I don't know how anything can survive in that water. Most people won't have to worry about the food being contaminated as much as workers and manufacturers of foodstuffs having to change up ingredients due to shortages and access to certain ingredients they've been using. Now you have new microorganisms and allergic reactions to these food ingredient changes. I could go on and on about the changes we will be facing as this event continues. The purpose of this presentation was to get you thinking not just about infection, but the domino effect this will have on everything else we take for granted in our lives. Let us use fear as energy to move us, but let us use rationality and logic to help each other sustain through this. We are going to have to be much smarter and think further ahead than we used to. And as we do get through this and it's all over and things get going again, hopefully we'll think more about what's on the horizon.